I often think that the deepest fear of the human heart, which is experienced universally, I think every human being on this planet has this same deep fear. It's actually a fear of being absolutely insignificant. Maybe you've never actually consciously stopped to think about that. But there is this fear that really in the big scheme of things, we are nothing. We're not actually important at all. And I think this fear is actually lurking in the background and shaping everything of what we do. So much of our life, our decisions, our behavior is trying to prove our significance, prove the fact that we're actually worth being loved, that we're actually valuable, that we're not just taking up extra oxygen. Now, there's obviously the great classic ways we do this. You know, people invest so much in their reputation, you know, their career, the appearances of the house, the car. In many ways, we use these things to portray a message to the world around us. I'm this sort of person. You know, the fact that I live in this suburb or I drive this car puts me somewhere on this level of ranking in society. And so therefore you should respect me. And yet, deep down, we know that really we are so weak and vulnerable. You know, I often hear many people talk about the fact that they hate visiting nursing homes because they're very confronting. And I think the reason is because this is a place where all of that appearance is suddenly stripped away. And you see people where they're, in some sense, reduced down to the very core of their weakness. And it's really difficult to have to see that because we know that we're going to get there one day ourselves. And so we try so hard to live in this artificial reality, trying to prove that we've actually got it all together. Now, in some sense, this is what Jesus is addressing in this parable today. He's talking about the fact that in many ways before each other, but even before God, we are trying to create this artificial reality. You know, so you've got this Pharisee who is standing before God with all of his achievements, his virtue, you know, his prayer, his sacrifice. Because of these things, I'm valuable and I should be loved. And in contrast, you've got this man who is a public sinner, you know, the tax collector who's in collusion with the Roman Empire. And yet he knows that he is broken. And so he stands before God and he says, God, I've got nothing. Have mercy on me. And here's where Jesus is saying that's the person that God looks at and loves. Now, this might be a bit hard to understand sometimes. We think, well, surely virtue is better than sin. One of the ways I try to understand this, if you think, you know, everyone these days has a perfect online profile, you know. Photographs are all perfectly photoshopped, so there's no blemishes, no hair is out of place. If you imagine that every person had this life-size cardboard cutout of themselves, and it was the perfect image of you. Yeah, so you look the most beautiful, the most attractive. And everywhere you went, you carried this cardboard cutout in front of you. And so when someone came to talk to you, you're basically saying, talk to this person. You know, this is the perfect version of me. Now, it sounds a bit ridiculous, but this is actually how we operate. You know, we're always putting on this performance. You know, only see the good side of me. Don't see the rest of it. The problem is that when we go to prayer, we do the same thing with God. It's as though we come before God with this cardboard cutout version of ourselves, and we say, look, God, I'm doing okay. I'm fine. I just need a little bit of help. If you can just answer a few of these prayers, then we'll be done. And I can go on my merry way. And then we complain that we don't actually encounter God's love. You know, people say, well, I pray and I don't encounter God. I don't feel his love. Because we're putting this artificial version of ourselves in his face. And God's there saying, I don't want to talk to that person. I want to talk to you. See, if we can come before God actually a bit stripped down, remove the mask, remove that veneer, and be a bit more like the tax collector, and just say, God, I'm a mess. If I'm really honest, there are things in my heart and my mind that I'm ashamed to talk to myself about, let alone to talk to God about. And yet this is who I am. I bring myself. Will you love this part of me? I think if you can come in prayer in that space of vulnerability, that is where you will encounter the love of God. And that's where you'll experience transformation and healing. You know, we need to come in that place of radical honesty and to realize that this is where freedom is found. You know, the whole of our society is enslaved to this desperate attempt to try and create the false self, to protect our image, to protect our reputation. But if you can know that you are loved by God in that weakest part of you, you are now suddenly free to stand before the world without having to defend yourself. There's a famous story told about St. Francis of Assisi. So when St. Francis was starting to gather various brothers for his congregation, the story was told that one of his brothers realized that late at night, when everyone else had fallen asleep, Francis would sneak out of the house every night. And this brother was a bit curious to know what was going on. So he very secretly followed Francis one night. And Francis would go up to the mountain behind Assisi and go into this clearing in the forest. And he would kneel down and pray for hours every night. And this made this brother even more curious, because he was like, well, how is he praying? What is his prayer? And so in the darkness, he crept as close as he could. And he could just hear Francis praying this prayer repeatedly over and over again. Who are you, Lord God, and who am I? Who are you, Lord God, and who am I? Now, this brother realized that this made so much sense. You know, Francis, still to this day, is renowned as being one of the most humble saints ever. So much of his writing was about the virtue of humility. And so at the core of his prayer, the prayer was a prayer of encounter. Like, God, I want to know who you are in your glory, in your majesty. But I also want to know the confronting truth of who I am. How small and insignificant, how weak and frail I am. But I think Francis discovered the secret of Christianity in this. That there is this great paradox between the fact that we are absolutely nothing, and yet by virtue of God's love for us, we are elevated to the highest point of dignity. And this is where Francis discovered joy. This is where he discovered freedom. And I think this is the invitation to us as well. If we can know that really horrible, confronting truth, that really we are nothing at all. In the broad scheme of things, we're a speck of dust. And yet the God of the universe loves you so much that he has adopted you as his child. The only thing great about us is the fact that we are loved. And it's in that place of humility, that place of truth, that we are then set free. So we need to really pray for that grace, that we can be vulnerable before God, and that we can then be set free so we can actually be vulnerable before each other. But as we come now into the rest of this Mass, let's really pray that we can know just how much we are loved. As small, as insignificant as we are, that even here at the Eucharist, God gives his very life to us because he loves this tiny, insignificant speck of dust so much.